to start this second plenary session of this morning. But before we start this plenary, I'm going to give a floor to Beatrice Dumbo. She would like to make an important announcement, which is certainly well adapted to this conference. There's a text that she's going to read.
Bon, je suis pas
This is not on the program, but I'll be brief. It's to talk to you for the Marseille call. You remember that 2 years ago we made a call in Marseille for the legalization of cannabis, which appeared in the media, and there were various ministers who visited us yesterday in the sensitive neighborhoods in our city who came to talk about drugs trafficking and the response they had in mind, which was increasing repression. As professionals of risk reduction, we were particularly struck because our services work with humble resources, limited resources. There's a stagnation, there's a lack of realization of the true situation of drug use in the city of Marseille, and it's the same for all of France. So this is a call in Marseille, but we would like you all to sign, however. Now, there's the link below where you can sign so that the public powers can really understand what the priorities are with regards to risk reduction and a health response to repression is expensive and it doesn't give anything. It's contrary to human rights. I needn't tell you, and in terms of public health, it's counterproductive because it distances users from the services that could be of use to them. And so this is the appeal, the Marseille appeal, or the call made in Marseille. And I thank you for your help. You can click on the link and sign.
Bon, alors quelques mots.
Well, just a few quick words now to present this session. This session will benefit from 2 chairs, a respondent chair, Didier, JAYLE, you already know, he will be one of the chairs, and he directed the interministerial fight against drug addiction. He's a dermatologist. He created CRIPS. He's a pioneer of the fight against AIDS. Didier JAYLE has militated for risk reductions and was worked for the SWAPS publication, a professor of addictology at CNAM. He is a militant and a scientist at the same time. Bernard KOUCHNER will also be here. You've already heard his presentation yesterday by the organizers of the conference. I think you all know him. He's a co-founder of Médecins du Monde, Médecins Frontières, and different Minister of Foreign Affairs in Europe. He represents the committed doctor and a politician, and also somebody who stimulated us to think about rights at a time when people are suffering. There's a duty to act, and you will see that there are connections with the subjects of risk reduction. So this round table will be between prohibition, public health, and society regulations. We've seen this, and also in yesterday's debates, there are different approaches, and we will be able to analyze this, the kaleidoscopic vision of cannabis, as a remedy and a poison, a medicament, and at the same time an illegal substance. So all of these statuses of cannabis means that we can have an approach in parts, and that will be talked about first of all by Andrew Friedman, the future of cannabis in the United States, and then for the policies, public human rights, and Milton ROMANI. You know how enthusiastic he is on this subject with this comparative analysis of cannabis legalization approaches. And then Ivana OBRADOVIC, who will present a comparative analysis of the legislation approaches on cannabis in different states and different countries. So we will see all the different approaches and how different countries have started up legislations, laws that are different and how they're done. And there isn't a continental harmony on the subject, but this is more like an archipelago that we will develop, and we hope that you all will be participating a lot in this session. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you to the organizer, particularly Jean-Pierre, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be able to preside this session. We're together with Bernard KOUCHNER. I would have preferred him to be here as a Minister of Health to present the new program of distribution of cannabis in France. But as he said yesterday, I fear, like him, that our country is perhaps will be the last one to do it, unfortunately. However, he was the first to prohibit cannabis. And in a peculiar way, it was 100 years ago, in 1916. In other words, in the trench wars, the National Assembly voted unanimously the prohibition law to prohibit opium, heroin, cocaine, and hashish. And why in 1916? But there were other things to do in the First World War. Was there an epidemic of drugs consumption? No. Was there urgency to ratify the first Hague conference of 2012? No. Well, in fact, the reason was that cocaine and heroin were products that came from a German chemical industry. So we weren't going to allow them to kill us with bullets and with drugs. So that was the first prohibition law passed in France. So why hashish? Nobody consumed it at that time. It's an obscure history. But 50 years later, a new law in 1970 it was passed, and that was also unanimously passed. 1970 is not a neutral time. It's just after the 1960 revolts in France. And it is a law that was made in order to fight against the degradation of public habits. And in the discussion said that violence, prostitution, homosexuality, masculine and feminine, are expanding, and everything is linked together. Drugs is without doubt the most serious effect of the loss of control that we are going through. So that was the spirit of the 1970 law, which was a repressive law, which was a public health law also, and which is still in force, although it's been amended recently, but I won't go into that. And I would like us to ask ourselves how that could be changed and what we would need for things to make progress. Some people said yesterday, the United Nations organization, the UN should propose a leap forward. I think that's a wish in the United Nations organization, there are 105 countries that are completely against this and would like to, in fact, harden them. So I agree with you. That's a wrong indication. The first country that changed was Switzerland in 2003, and they had a very elaborate program of controlled distribution, and they announced it officially even here in France. They did it in Pau in 2003, and then there was a change in the majority government. And so that draft bill was withdrawn, and then Uruguay was in fact the first country to legalize cannabis. And we have to say this is what is important. There's a new breath of air coming from the Americas. Uruguay was the first. Milton will be talking about that later on. And then there's Canada recently. And then United States of America. United States of America, it's not the country, but it is various states. The first one was Colorado, then Washington State, and then particularly California, 2016, wasn't it? California, which is the biggest U.S. state and has a huge world influence, is the heart of the Western world today. So this change in California will have a major impact, I believe. And another consequence of the legalization in American states, which is a little bit paradoxical with regards to the U.S. position in the world. But for 100 years, since Shanghai, it is the United States have been the only country in the world that makes drugs policy a priority in foreign policy. And they've always fought with drugs. After the First World War, the U.S. imposed to stay at the negotiations that the Hague Convention should be included in the Versailles Treaty. I can give you many more examples, but it is true that the U.S. has a repressive position in the majority of its states, but the fact that in the United States is the only country where you'll be able to procure, to get cannabis freely, that weakens the position of people who are repressive in the United States. I think that will change the balance of powers in the United Nations organization, but it will be very slow. But I think the indirect impact of California will have an influence and consequences in thought in general. And, to come back to France, as Bernard Kouchner said, the politicians are not going to make just laws that will lose them votes. Nevertheless, there are things that are going forward in France, and you've seen that in the last presidential elections here in France, the left-wing candidates have openly, and they've explained this very well, Monsieur Mélenchon and others, they've really defended legalization. And this is something completely new in France. Before, it was when a socialist defended legalization were told off, and then they shut up. But now, Macron, as a candidate, promised a debate on legalization, but we're still waiting. And if you look at the French, the polls show, Liana said it yesterday, that 90% are in favor of therapeutic cannabis. This allows the Minister of Health, Madame Buzyn to open that file and to make progress with the support of the Prime Minister, even if others stay quiet. For therapeutic cannabis is not the same. It's 50%. 50% are in favor. It's twice as much as 15 years ago, but 50% is not enough, really. It's too hard to change the law with that proportion. And if you have, and the people who are over age 50 are less favorable, but overall it is 50%, and that is everywhere, whether it is in cities or in the countryside, rural areas, or throughout different classes. It's about 50-50. But we have to increase that proportion. As André said yesterday, if there isn't a majority of the population who have this idea of change, then no politician will take on the responsibility of changing the law. So therefore, I am quite optimistic. Civil society can mobilize much more, and it is true when we go to the countries that have changed. For example, in Washington State, I've been there. There was a big cannabis fair, and it was a popular celebration to change things. It was the same in Colorado. The Hemp Fest, it was called, and we don't have that in France. 18th of June is a long time ago, but civil society and pro-legalization associations have to create a structure, and legal, financial resources are needed to make progress, because not much progress is being made right now. And I'll just finish with this. In rural France, right-wing and left-wing, we've just opened a field, for an area for discussion. And I think that this is something that we have to look closely. And I wouldn't be surprised if by 2020 that there will be different fines to what we have now. And also, there's the European Union, and I believe in that more than in the United Nations, and many countries, and in Switzerland also, things are progressing. It's not at a government level. This is being done at a local level. It's done at a regional level, at the canton level, at the Länder level. There's something that we cannot really do in France, because France is too centralized. If we change something in France, it's everywhere the same immediately. And our regions and our départements don't have any responsibilities or competencies. Without this decentralization, I think, nevertheless, what is already happening in Zurich, Geneva, Lausanne, Neuchâtel, in Berlin, in Barcelona, in Madrid, will really change things. So there's a moment in time when France cannot eternally be apart for ideological reasons and sustain a system that does not work, and which goes together with the highest consumption in the world. I thank you, and I'll give the floor first of all to Bernard KOUCHNER, if he wants to react. Well, I was thinking about this question of decentralization also in France. Regions have little competence in these areas, but they do have responsibilities in research, perhaps, in there. Don't you think that the regions have a role to develop research and also to raise awareness about the subject, to be able to better feed a better documented debate? Thank you. Well, I've understood something with you. We have to be positive, because otherwise we aren't understood. And that is a euphemism. So what Didier has just said is unfortunately true. He has underlined also, by the by, that since the 18th of June appeal, which I signed, and that was 50 years ago, wasn't it? So progress is, there is progress, but I would like to say a word about money and the way you have presented things. Right now, there's a crisis in emergencies, which is great. 250, 350 hospitals with doctors. When they strike, they work, and they just have a label saying "on strike" on their chest. But either you do politics or not, and you have to do politics. And yesterday was a good example of the reports between drug addiction and the fight of overdose and everything, and politics. It is a political subject. It's not a humanitarian subject. It's not charity. It's not drug addiction alone. No, it is a political matter. Whilst there aren't any strongly political approaches, even at the most basic level, at a partisan level. No, there are no longer any political parties, so it's not really working. But you have to make it political. In other words, you have to be resolutely committed to challenge, to make things move, to have debates with the politicians. You've talked about the regions, and precisely that is an easier scale to convince. But at the same time, you're right, you've given the information that everybody knows, that there's no regional power in order to change law. Regions don't have that power. So it is elementary politics that is at the ground, that you have to place that problem. Well, the problem of cannabis, for example. There may be a leap forward, but I don't know when. But I'll go back to emergencies. There, an emergency within the emergency, you need the money. It's as simple as that. Madame Buzyn has taken out from her budget, because there's a huge budget, which is the medical insurance, which is separate from the state budget, and there's a little health budget. And for her health budget, for 3 years, has 700 million. And that's very little amount, but it's okay. But it does not give the necessary response to what is necessary. And if you're asked to choose, because this is what happens in the public's mind, do we have to finance the emergency system in France in the broadest sense, or should we give some money? For example, we've always seduced how in Barcelona, with limited resources, but nevertheless there were resources, and to give all of that, all the importance to that. But what would you do? I also like that expression in the press. They say we have unblocked. We haven't unblocked anyway when we give money. We've taken it from somewhere else in the budget. There isn't any hidden budget that you can just use to be nice or kind, or that you'd forgotten about. No, there's a state budget that is very strictly controlled. And I think that if we're not deeply political, then I can give you some examples of how should we go out and protest and march and write some articles or whatever. You have to do everything. But as this has been done a couple of times within a political program, the problem the programs that you mentioned, Hamon, was 4%. But we can gather people from the right and from the left to go a little bit further in the most political way. If you deny the political word, then it'll all work much more slowly. we're going to give the floor to the different participants. So we'll ask Andrew to come and tell us about the situation in the US. And Andrew, I think you're familiar with the situation in France. Perhaps you have some advice for France or some ideas. That would be very welcome.
You are welcome.
I don't think it's ever a good idea for the United States to have
you have 15 minutes?
Ideas for France, yeah. Thank you. But if I was, if we had to deal with United States hypocrisy, we might be here all day. Thanks for having me today. For those who weren't there last night, a very quick introduction of myself. I was the Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff in Colorado, meaning I worked for essentially the second in command for the state of Colorado when the governor approached me and asked me to be the cannabis czar, which was the first time I'd ever thought about cannabis legalization in my entire life. And since then, it has launched this very strange career where I go essentially from government to government and help implement newly legalized states. So it has given me this incredible insight into what is happening and a very a very clear view of how the politics are changing around legalization, at least in North America. And so what I hope to do today, yesterday I made the argument that legalization is inevitable within the United States. Today I want to talk a little bit more about what that actually means, what it will look like, what I think it'll look like. It'll be a little bit more conjecture, but I do have a pretty good idea of the powers that be and how legalization will ultimately look in the United States, because I think that will have, I know that will have a very big impact on what the future of cannabis legalization will look like in the world. So the title of my speech is cannabis going to be treated as an intoxicant, a medicine, or a criminal substance? I won't hide the conclusion. I think it will be treated as an intoxicant in the United States very soon. I think that we will be dealing with the idea that it's a medicine and what that means for a long time, but I don't think there'll be a clear answer in the United States. And so in order to kind of unpack that a little bit for everybody, I'm going to start with how it's graded right now. What lessons have we learned from Colorado, from legalized states, how the United States views legalization to date, and then move into the dynamics of what that means it will look like in the future. So outside of the public health world, in the general population, this is what people generally care about for legalization. The first question that always comes up is what is happening with the youth? A little less what is happening with the adults and the frequency of use, although that is part of the conversation. Second, what is happening with hospitalizations due to legalization. Third, driving while high. Finally, arrest rates and tax revenue. And that, in general, occupies 95% of the space of what we talk about when we look at legalization. So I'm going to go through Colorado's numbers on this. Colorado was the first to legalize. It was also the first to capture the vast majority of the market inside its own borders. So 95% of people who go to buy cannabis right now in Colorado go to a Colorado dispensary. And so there's probably some of the cleanest data to come out of the United States right now. A bit of optimism. Past 30-day use, according to our national survey in Colorado, there's been a 14% decrease in, does this have a neat little pointer? Cool. That was the date of commercialization. That is a statistically significant decrease in 30-day past use for youth ages 12 to 17. We have a couple of different surveys. They all really do show a decrease in youth use post-legalization, which I think is good news overall. It is self-reported data. I mean, it's an anonymous survey, but it's essentially the best we have. I will also point out, though, that it is higher than the national average. It's been higher than the national average for a long time, and it's not as much higher than the national average than it was before, but overall, I would say we've seen good news in the youth use data. A little bit more mixed in the older years about what we're seeing. There has been a pretty large, especially around the 4th year, increase in 26 to 34-year-olds who've been using in the past month. I will say, actually, the 65 plus was the first to show a statistically significant increase, even though they're kind of the lowest on there. But really over the last year, we've really seen the 26 to 34-year-olds using more. Although I would say past 30-day use is not really a good measure of public health consequences of legalization. That I'm not very bothered by people that decide to use cannabis in a world of cannabis legalization, especially because there's a lot of other questions about that. Are they doing it instead of drinking? Are they doing it instead of smoking tobacco? The question alone of have you used in the past 30 days does not tell us a lot about the health of the public health of Colorado. There's a little bit more information we have here, which is of those people who've used in the last 30 days, how often are they using? And there's some things to be concerned about here, and we'll pick it up later on about what I think legalization is going to look like, is that you're really seeing a slow, not even so slow, but an increase on people who've moved from this kind of mid-range using every other day to really daily users of cannabis. And what would be very interesting in there is to see who goes from using once daily to 2, 3 times a day, daily, and really knowing who's picking up cannabis use disorder that otherwise would not be. But certainly it's showing a lot of trends that you do also see in alcohol and tobacco, which is when price lowers, people do tend to use more of a substance, and the price is lowering in Colorado. This is one of the data forms to be more concerned about. There was an increase in poison control center calls in Colorado post-legalization. It was really an issue of naive users using new products. And the most typical is tourists using edibles, and it's always the same story. You're a tourist, you come in, you try a piece of edible candy. Even though everybody's told you to wait for 3 hours, when you feel nothing in an hour, you have a second edible. And then you wait another hour, and then you start drinking. And then you have a just crazy acute psychotic break. And for the most part, you are actually not, there's no long-term damage to that, except during the time of the break, you are a danger to yourself and those around you. There's been a few, and really very few, tragic incidents that have come of this. One kid fell off the roof of his hotel and died very early on in legalization. We were very fearful we would be seeing that a lot, and we actually haven't. But a good reason for a lot of public education campaign is that there's new products out there and naive users that want to get out of there. I always like to keep this in relation, so this big spike right here is also represented by this green line right here. During the peak of Poison Control Center calls in Colorado, there were 230 calls to the Poison Control Center. That same year for alcohol was 6,598. And so certainly not a public health crisis when you look at the difference between what we're seeing in alcohol versus cannabis. This is also, I think, one of the more concerning things to be looking at, which is Colorado drivers involved in fatal accidents are testing positive for cannabis at a higher rate than they were before legalization. And that includes active cannabis and inactive cannabis. That includes cannabis alone and cannabis with alcohol. There does seem to be an increase in people who are high while involved in fatal accidents in Colorado. And that doesn't mean they caused the accident. There's a lot we don't know because of that data, but I would say nevertheless concerning data. However, there's also, just like the Poison Control Center calls, and I know these numbers are hard to read, before you say like that means Colorado is unsafe because they legalized cannabis, Colorado remains per 100,000 population and both per 100 million vehicle miles driven, Colorado remains below the national average of deaths. So it's still safer to be in Colorado in driving than it is to be on an average US roadway. California is significantly below the national average, and a place like Arkansas that has no legalization at all is well above the national average for highway deaths per mile driven or per population. And so one of the things we talk about a lot is that if you look very closely at only the cannabis data, you might think that there's a public health problem, but when you pull out and you look at the top line numbers, it really does not have a huge impact on what we're seeing at the top. There's many more difficulties for driving. Driving while distracted, driving while drunk have much bigger impacts on the top line numbers than cannabis. One of the positives that we have seen, and this doesn't show up too well, but we have seen a decrease in the arrest rate, or in raw arrests across the board in cannabis. I broke it out by race underneath it. Unfortunately, that decrease has happened. There's still the same arrest rate disparity, meaning we are still arresting blacks and Hispanics at a greater rate than we are white people. Essentially, and I was talking about this last night to a colleague, we have not solved racism in policing, but we have arrested fewer people, and so that's overall a positive thing. Okay. But still, obviously, this is a much bigger conversation than legalization. Tax revenue, and this was up yesterday, is also seen as a general positive. In the last full year, we got $266 million in tax revenue that otherwise would not come into Colorado. There are still some ongoing issues that I think anybody who's dealing in the world of cannabis policy is dealing with. The first is we have no idea how to talk about potency. Unlike alcohol, that you know what is a safe amount to drink and drive, what is a safe amount to have at night, what makes you a heavy user, a light user. Potency has none of that language around it. And so not only is it a problem because all the potency ranges changes, but also the delivery mechanisms are much, much different. So even if it's a low potency amount, but you are using a lot in a single serving, that's a problem. Where high potency, maybe you're pulling just a little bit off and it's not a problem. Vaping, I think there's this huge debate going on right now, and there's a miniature crisis going on of why are people showing up in the hospitals because of vaping. I think we're going to see that that's a quality control issue, and that there's some chemicals that shouldn't be in the vape pens. But it is this large new phenomenon in the United States that we have no research behind. And finally, health and economic equity, which deserves a lot more than 30 seconds. But I would say a lot of people expected a greater amount of the benefit to go to those most impacted by the war on drugs. And for a lot of reasons, that's not really happening, as I showed you with the arrest data before, but also in the economics of who owns these licenses to sell and distribute cannabis. It's turning out that it's mainly going to people who have a lot of money already. It's very high barriers to entry, and it's also an agricultural commodity, so the margins of profit are small, and so it really does help to have $10 million going into the industry rather than only having $1 million when you try to start a business. This is an issue I brought up yesterday, which is, will marijuana ever be medical, rather than kind of the states just declaring stuff to be medical. I think that this is going to be kind of a stepchild issue in the United States for a long time, that we really won't know what to do with this as a medicine. Will it ever go the traditional route where it has to go through FDA approval and has to become a medicine much like Epidiolex? Or is it going to continue to be kind of self-branded as medicine? And I don't have an answer for you of where that's going to go. It is going to be, I think, an open question for a long time. But this is what's really going on, is that big marijuana has come. Altria, AB InBev, Novartis have all made billion-dollar purchases. And so what I think that means is I think that means cannabis is going to be treated as an intoxicant, and I think it's going to be treated as an intoxicant in the United States soon. I think that's a relatively good thing. I think that's the right, we can have a public health framework because we are treating it as an intoxicant. But what I would worry about, and what I do worry about, is the 80-20 rule, that 20% of the users use 80% of the products, and that you now have people who are growing at large scales, who are selling an agricultural commodity. And when we've seen that dynamic before, such as in tobacco, the thing we see is the only way for them to grow the size of their pie is to prey on people who are likely to become more addicted to the substance, get them addicted at an earlier age, or get those already addicted to use more. And so this is my word of caution, I would say, to a group like this, which is now that those people have made significant investments in Canada and the United States, those are going to be the global leaders of cannabis legalization. I'm not saying this as something to battle against. I'm saying this is a political reality. And so what we have to do is set up the right guardrails right now to be ready to really battle back against this 2080 rule. I think, and I mentioned this yesterday, that involves really bearing down on research right away. I think that involves talking about price controls on day one. Let's make sure that there's a floor to how low the prices can drop, because that's a real way to get a lot more people addicted into a substance. Let's talk about advertising restrictions being as strict as possible on day one, and let's talk about the sort of quality control mechanisms that really make sure nothing is showing up with cannabis, harmful chemicals that then 10 years later, everybody's showing up with cancer in the hospitals. So we've learned a lot from big alcohol and big tobacco already about best guardrails, but I would say it's beholden on us to really come in strong with the muscles we already know about how to best treat this as a public health intoxicant. So I thank you for this. I look forward to the debate.
Merci beaucoup. Ces résultats.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that fascinating results, and it shows that this works. The system works, and there are no major problems. A concern about road accidents, nevertheless, but there is a reduction in consumption among the young, and that's extraordinary, and that's the aim, really, if there's a problem, is with the young particularly, by allowing the mafia to do prevention, distribution, and information. And that way, we will not be able to reduce consumption among the young if we leave it in their hands. And this gentleman is speaking without a microphone, so I can't translate. We saw the same phenomenon in the Netherlands with the coffee shops. The young Dutch people are not interested by cannabis particularly. So it's true. They have problems with alcohol, MPS, but for cannabis, not. And heroin. And Amsterdam has become a city without heroin also. We'll have the debate afterwards, but we'll give the floor now to Milton, who will talk to us about the inspirational model, the inspired model, inspired by the public health system of Uruguay. Thank you very much. You have 15 minutes. Hello, good morning, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I chose a concept by Jean-Paul Sartre, which I always liked, and I think this is very pertinent to what we are discussing. It says the decision of change comes from the change of point of view, of a conceptual opening, imaginary opening towards another possible situation. It's not because you're aware that a situation can be put up with that you decide to change it. It is on the day that you conceive that a situation might change, that is when you realize that it cannot be, that you cannot bear it anymore. For me, that's an important idea here on this subject. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association revised SM4, and they raised the consideration that homosexuality was a disease. 2 years later, the Psychology Association not only revised that criterion, but it ethically condemned all the compulsive therapies in order to twist the disease of homosexuality. I don't know how many politicians nowadays would dare not to consider within their programs and in their discourses contemplation of the equality of genders, equality in matrimony, the consideration of the rights of all homosexuals, male and female, the voluntary interruption of pregnancy, which are like the trans law also, and this is the new generation of rights which we have promulgated in Uruguay. perhaps 46 years ago, it was very difficult to include these subjects in our political discourse. Now, not only scientific evidence, but the facts have enabled another possible situation that tells us that the situation that we had before was unbearable. And with drugs, with regards to the report by Rock in 1998, Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations, he was finishing the second special session at the United Nations talking about the world drug problem. It was the second of 3 that have been given on that subject, and he proposed a toast for a world free of drugs. My cousin Oriol Romani would say that is an aristopy. But Kofi Annan was a politician, an intellectual, and a scientist. Now he has passed away. But in 2016, before the 3rd session, he wrote a brilliant article in the Huffington Post saying it is time to legalize drugs. And he had a lot of intellectual valor to go from a world free of drugs to saying now we have to legalize it, because there are 300 million drugs users in the world who require a budget concentrating on reducing the supply of 100 billion euros in a business that generates more than 300 billion euros when and Manuel and Kofi Annan said this hasn't been a war against drugs, it's been a war against people, because those who have died and those who are put in prison and those who are persecuted, apart from the users and the consumers, are the lower levels of the drugs trafficking chain. And so it is very difficult to control that paradigm. The problem of drugs is not resolved by prohibiting them. It makes the merchandise more expensive, and so it's more difficult for users to access to it. And this has been a disaster, and it twists things, and neoliberal school economists like Milton Friedman and who are opposing political sides to me, but they do a significant analysis of the distortion of the market economy by prohibiting goods like drugs or merchandise like drugs. In the latest World Report of the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, it says that it is not the sanctuary of legalization, it is the hardcore prohibition. But they give data nevertheless, and that are very clear. After 60 years of the war against drugs, of the control of drugs, and in my continent it is costing many human lives, because the war against drugs has not only been a war against people. In Latin America, it has been the pretext so that the United States occupies with military equipment and bases, and now in Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, with bases in Peru, under the pretext of drugs trafficking. There has been a geopolitical design that has cost many lives in Latin America. The production of opium multiplied 65% more, with a contribution from Afghanistan, which has been militarily occupied for more than 20 years. And in the last year, there was 65% more production of opium, and the production on Afghanistan land, which was imported before. In Colombia, there's 30% more production of cocaine. So 1 out of every 6 drugs users receives treatment. And there is only 34 countries that have policies of syringe exchange and substitution of opiates and retroviral treatment. Only 162 countries did not respond to the international system, and through the international committee that requires an annual reporting of the situation of drugs in each country. The last special session in April 2016 in New York had a debate, a very weak, a very limp debate. There was a number of countries, just very few, among them the European Union, that asked for a debate, an open debate, an inclusive debate without any taboos. When we say inclusive, we mean thinking that other agencies in the United Nations could become involved, because they had been prohibited from talking about the problem of drugs virtually. The United Nations Development Programme, for example, the World Health Organization, for example, also. But what is most important is the Committee for Human Rights and the High Commission for Human Rights in Geneva. The focus, for the first time, they made a focus of human rights. 5 minutes, okay. However, in the final document in 2016, I think we made a little bit of progress, and it is a trench to continue to debate and to continue to insist. The world is in a majority prohibitionist. We have to understand that. Uruguay sometimes feels a little bit like Asterix. In the final document, UNGAS, there's a slight breakaway from that single idea. And it says that the challenges and the new challenges for countries will have to be faced, bearing in mind that the conventions have sufficient flexibility in order to develop national sovereign programs. Well, it doesn't say sovereign, but that concept of flexibilization, being more flexible, was incorporated by the United States, but the intellectual creator was Brazil, which not the flexible interpretation of the conventions, no, not that, but it says that they have sufficient flexibility in order to develop the new challenges and difficulties. Some people don't agree with the final document, neither am I, but that is a small crack in the prohibitionist bloc. And so this began since 2008. In 2008, Uruguay was included in the Drugs Commission, which is under ECOSOC, and to which 33 countries belong. In that year, 2008, Uruguay started by presenting a declaration or a draft declaration, which we'd drawn up with a civil society organization, which was co-sponsored by Argentina, Bolivia, and Switzerland. Then the European Union supported it also. So it was an important diplomatic battle, and that is the Declaration 5112, which talks about the human rights instruments, because in the name of drugs, the most incredible actions are taken with human beings. Every year we try to vote a moratorium for the death penalty for minor drugs offences. There's no possibilities of voting that. There is a disproportion. There's a criminalization that is still there. But in 2008, Uruguay threatened for asking for the vote, which is not normally done, and there was a triumph that was achieved because the point of view of human rights was begun to be included in the debate on drugs policy, and beyond the humanist and health point of view, the point of view of human rights is what will allow us nationally and internationally to open the path to change the situation. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. Now the floor is given to our last speaker, Ivana OBRADOVIC. She's going to provide a situation update between the United States, Uruguay, and Canada as well. Thank you, Ivana. Thank you. Good morning to you. Well, indeed, I'm here very quickly to give you a quick comparative analysis of the different legalization approaches in the world, and I'm going to concentrate on 5 parts. First, the objectives of those new legislations. They have a number of things in common, but also some differences. How the reform took place was point number 2. Number 3, the offer and the regulation framework. Then point 4, the difficulties that those different countries or states encountered. And point 5, what will be the effects, knowing that you need at least 5 years to see the results. So I will concentrate on the state of Washington, Colorado, and Uruguay, countries in which we have about 5 years follow-up. To answer those 5 different questions, I will use a study named Cannabis. We conducted 2 studies on site in 2015 and 16 respectively, and we conducted about 100 interviews with key players. And also I will base my answers on a study named Astrakhan, which is conducted in the state of Washington, Oregon, and California, and also Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec in Canada, to try again and draw a few comparisons. So I'm not going to provide the same snapshot time and time again. So we have 11 states where the use and possession of cannabis has been legalized, and in Canada we have the same situation. So in total, we are talking about 128 million inhabitants where non-therapeutic cannabis is legalized. It would be a little more if we were to include the states where therapeutic cannabis is organized. So this represents 3% of the world population, 13% of the inhabitants of the Americas. Now, what were the objectives for that reform? There were a number of common points. First, to neutralize the black market and also weaken criminality and criminal networks. Second objective, protect minors, reduce the consumption of cannabis and maybe have a later start of usage. And point number 3, better control the different products in terms of composition, concentration, production, and also transformation. So generally speaking, to avoid that those products are cut and that those byproducts are more deleterious than the original product. Now, there are also differences in the objectives. The objective was also to have a better control on the therapeutical cannabis market. This was a concern in Canada and in the United States as well. So the idea again was to try to integrate both markets, the medical market and the recreational market. The second objective was to try and reduce the number of disparities. Andrew mentioned that previously, try to have less differences in the numbers of arrests by ethnicity. Point number 3 was also to have more tax revenues. In the United States, it was one of the major arguments in favor of that reform, to have more money, so to also fight against public deficits. And in Canada, the take on that was more to foster economic growth, but also there's an international context which is a bit tense with the United States, and that was a way to compete with the United States as well. Point number 4, strengthen access to prevention and better management generally. That was points that were very important for Canada and Uruguay. And also, further objective was to fight against the increased use of other products. So this is prensado, which is cannabis imported from Paraguay, poor quality, and it was really damaging for, especially for the youth. In Canada, they mostly wanted to reduce the consumption of alcohol and opioids. Now, of course, the political, cultural contexts are very different. Also, the traditions when it comes to legislation and regulations. On tobacco, for instance, those are states where they've done pretty well. But in Uruguay, for instance, we have a state which has a number of regulations on gambling, on prostitution. So those are amongst the countries of the world where they have quite a number of regulations. Now, on the different trajectories of reform, this is a very busy slide, but what you see here are the different milestones when the reform was adopted. Now, what you have in red are the decision-making approach. Was it bottom-up or top-down? When I say bottom-up, is somehow the initiative came from the government. When we are top-down, obviously, without grassroots initiatives, mostly in the United States, except for Vermont and Illinois, when it was an initiative from the governor. Now, in Uruguay and Canada, clearly it was a will of the government. It was against the will of the people, but it's true that in Canada it was a promise by Mr. Trudeau. Another interesting slide, you have the different authorities. There are different cases. Either those are public authorities or private bodies, and sometimes a mixed sort of body. In Canada and Uruguay, there's a body which centralizes a number of parts of this new regulation, especially when it comes to production. And in the United States, what is very interesting is that those are either agencies that are already in charge of alcohol control, but sometimes it's also tax authorities that are also in charge of cannabis, so regulatory affairs, or in some cases the Department of Health. The conditions to access those products differ from one country to the next. So the age is 18 in Uruguay, and then most of the Canadian provinces, I'm sorry, 18 in 2 Canadian provinces, 19 in the others, and then it's 21 in all American states. Now, when we look at the maximum quantity, this is the far right, the column, 10 grams in Uruguay, up to 30 grams in Canada, and about 30 grams in the United States. Some allow for you to hold more plants at home, but not in public. Cultivation is authorized in a number of countries. It's forbidden in Washington State. It's also forbidden in Manitoba. But in all the other states and in all the other countries, it is possible to grow from 2 to 6 plants, and you also have differences by adult but also by household. So quickly on the implementation, I just decided to compare 3 countries or states so that it is easier to read. Here you have states in which the market is mostly profit-oriented with private players, but you have a few nuances. In Colorado, 569 shops are open. They opened pretty quickly in the first year. There were more such shops than Starbucks or such. So this is something that was widely advertised in the press. And this is also why I mentioned that. Today in Colorado, you have more shops, obviously, than you have in Canada. In Uruguay, I didn't mention that too much, but there are 3 ways through which you can access either when you cultivate the plant, the cannabis social clubs, so a cooperative of users. It exists in other European countries, but it's more of a grey area of legislation. And the third avenue is the availability in pharmacies or drugstores. But there were a number of pharmacies that were not so much in favor of that. And so you have the updated figures on the number of growers, Cannabis Social Club, and pharmacies. It represents 1% of all the pharmacies in the country. So it's not to say that accessibility is very high through that route. I'm not going to comment too much the market conditions, but I'm just showing a few slides for you to have an idea what it looks like. Well, from the outside, it looks like an espresso shop, really, with products that sometimes that are readily accessible to the clients. They can touch your products. You have many lights. So you really have all the usual marketing codes that you find in this type of shops for other products. From the outside, those shops are not very visible, except at night, obviously, but if not, they're not really visible. And the period of time during which they are open, most of the time 24/7. This is in Seattle, where you have a high gentrification in this neighborhood, and so you see a number of cars coming and going with a big parking lot, but again, this is the United States. You really under the impression that you belong to a club, because before you enter, you are supposed to present a valid ID. Now, in the United States, there's a wide variety of products available, some that can be smoked, vaped, that you can eat, sweets, also you have products, well-being products, cosmetics, you can use dabbing. In Uruguay, it's more craftsmanship-like. So this is the Cannabis Social Club. So again, you have this feeling of community. So it's more on the craftsman side than on the industrial side. And in the pharmacy, this is what it looks like. You have two varieties of cannabis which are available, with indications that are pretty precise. The rate of THC is limited between 8 and 10%, if I'm not mistaken. In Colorado, the average concentration is 69%, according to the figures I have. So you do see the difference. And to the left, you have a snapshot of the day of on the day of opening of that pharmacy. And so this was very different from the day the market opened in California. So a lot more people there. And again, this is in Quebec, which is yet something different. You have the Société Québécoise du Cannabis, which is in charge of regulation. So it's you can't contact for products. You have salesperson. The label is pretty standard. You have three types: sativa, hybrid, and the other one I didn't remember. I'm sorry. Now I'm just back from Quebec, so it's pretty fresh in my mind. And you have the logo of the body, which is very simple. Well, this is supposed to represent a cannabis leaf, but it is one, so it's pretty streamlined. Now, before I conclude, I'm going to talk about the different obstacles, difficulties that were encountered. In all cases, this was a regulation that was improved as they went. I talked with a Colorado representative, and she said, well, it was like building an airplane while in the air. And I thought it was a very striking but telling sentence as well. Other problems that they were faced with was how to adjust offer and demand. So either they were short, they had a shortage, or in some cases like Oregon, they overproduce. They have 5 years of stocks. So again, this extra regulation is, of course, so there's a lot. There's a cannabis market, legal and illegal as well, because of this overproduction, because those growers no longer know what to do with all those products. You also have a problem of the THC rate in Uruguay. For the regular users, they had a hard time, especially in the pharmacy. They had a hard time finding products with enough THC, and so sometimes it discouraged them from going to the pharmacy, and they probably went back to the illicit market to find the proper THC rate that they were looking for. Also, as KOUCHNER said, we need human means, we need human resources to have a better control, better promotion as well. Fourth point, the different jurisdiction and the conflicts in between jurisdiction. In the United States, it's forbidden at the federal level, but authorized at some state levels. And reversely, in Canada, it was a decision by the federal government, and a number of provinces were against, especially in Quebec. The resistance is very high, and the more conservative government, François Legault, would like to restrict access to cannabis in Quebec. They would like to increase the age, for instance, at 21 instead of 19. So it will be interesting to follow up on that in the coming years or months. And then there's this paradox with underage, for underage use. The underage use, those younger adults resort to the black market because of that minimum age. And so this is something that was not necessarily completely thought about. Now, first effects, if you were here during the debate, you certainly had an interesting a number of presentations on that. Again, you have a comparison. Those are the monthly sales in Colorado, more than $100 million per month, and I think it's on the rise. There's also this question of the indirect businesses. Tourism in Colorado, they are known for their ski resort, but you now have the skiers that also like cannabis coming to this state. So this is something different. You also have buses on which you can buy the product and consume in the bus. You have new apps like Hi There, where you can, well, date and smoke. You can also have weed weddings, where you're going to have catering facilities with cannabis-containing products. So, you know, lots of avenues. People are very creative, but when it comes to tax resources, promises are kept. You do see the quite impressive results in those last 5 years in Colorado in yellow and Washington in brown. Today, the state of Washington is making the most revenues with a regulation which is pretty prudent, and I'm not sure if Andrew would like to comment on that, but they still make very good revenues, tax revenues. Now, those are the figures when it comes to public health. It seems that cannabis becomes normal with younger users. There are more products, and therefore you are incited to consume, and this is also strengthened by marketing and this type of advertisement. So you have cute kitties claiming that they are high, and you also have those comparisons that are forbidden in France, but they seem to say that cannabis is safer and better than beer or wine. The different logos on this market look cool. It's a very nice logo, very nice streamlined presentation, and obviously they're more and more targeting older people. CBD would be apparently the cure to all illnesses. Now, if we compare between the opening of the market and now, this is in Colorado, a number of food products, edibles, were developed. It started at 15% as of 2014, when the market was open. Then that share remained pretty stable. Now, what is increasing is the share of concentrates, which sort of doubled in 4 years. 1/4 of the market are concentrates, sometimes as high as 69 to 70% of THC. Now, crime, there's still a good resilience of the black market, reorganization of cartels. I don't think that we have data for Uruguay, so this is mostly for the United States. New types of offenses, and therefore there was also more safety issues, especially in the shops where they would have bigger quantities of those substances. There are also a number of questions about banking. So there's new crime around that. Those new businesses. Road safety, I'm sorry, battle figures, it's not that clear-cut. And again, there's the question of equality in connection with prices. So far, legalization has not benefited so much to the less privileged in the United States when it comes to access to market, to become a player, becoming a business owner. But on the side of users, a wide majority of them still resort to the black market for financial reasons. Now, the challenges are changing. This has not become a financial challenge, more than a political and diplomatic challenge. So it's more has to do with finance and industrial challenges. When you look at the rate at which this market is developing, also in Europe, especially in Germany. Germany is a huge importer of medical cannabis from Canada. Second question, the conditions in which people practice in the United States. So far, it has not been regulated, but it seems that when I talked with a number of people during a fringe event of a conference, a number of players think that maybe things were too quick, and the conditions in which people do consume is not sufficiently controlled. Number of people also mentioned that it would be nice to have a regulation which would be maybe customized or adapted, whether this is recreational use or therapeutic use. Also, there's a question of monopoly in some states. Now, there are still pending questions. It's difficult to assess how and when the black market is going to be completely will be completely eliminated. There are also impacts on the environment with the use of water, the use of pesticides and phytosanitary products, and so those are new challenges that also need to be explored. And so I think that we need to strengthen our knowledge, so we need to finance research on CBD, long-term effects of highly concentrated products and the effects of those policies. Thank you very much. You have here a few references that you may want to read if you want to increase your knowledge. Thank you.
Ivana.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Very nice presentation. Excellent. I would like to congratulate you, not only Ivana, the FDT also, the IHOF for Security and Justice, because you've taken a very early initiative, because you are there to follow on what is going on in France. You've gone there and to Washington, to Canada, to see what is happening and to have a critical analysis, because it's not just media work. You've worked in depth, and it's quite exceptional to have a critical analysis. So I invite you to look at Cannabis, which is available on internet, and there you have all the details of the study and what you've written in the publication SWAP on the health workers who are very reticent. So what is happening and who are concerned. And on paper, you can see how many people they're not ready. And so the floor will be for the auditorium as well. This leads us to think about, we have to think about this, but we mustn't be blocked by this. It's not a question of waiting and seeing. We have to go forward, and with the EFDT work, we have to have more of a scientific basis, and we have to open out the debate in France. The debate, as I said yesterday, is not possible really, because to present drugs in a favorable light is prohibited, so that blocks us, and it prevents researchers also from continuing. For example, with medical cannabis, we talk a lot about the huge number of French people who are in favor of medical cannabis, but the unfortunate adventure of cannabis oil, it was a CBD spray, which was recommended for invalidating illnesses, sclerose, and in Strasbourg, France was made to conform, and they still haven't done it because there were problems with the price with the sickness insurance. But there's a large consensus in among French people, and there are books also of people who were not drug users who got to cannabis through care, but that in spite of politicians having support among the public, we see things are not changing in France. And with regards to what you were saying about the 1970 law, it is true, we mustn't forget the weight of the United States of America, which at that time, Nixon indeed, he banged on the table and said he forced all his allies, let's say, to adopt this law in 1970. So it is true that the new breath of fresh air is now coming from the United States, and that's something that's good. And with regards to United Nations, I went to Vienna, and I was very surprised when I was speaking at lunchtime with the employees. And it is with the armed branch of repression said there's an antipathy for drugs users, and it has also been there has been progress in the agency, and so and in 2016 we were expecting too much, and so we were disappointed. But we have to know that it was foreseen for 2019. There was 45 countries who had asked for that meeting to be brought forward, mainly countries from Latin America. So things are beginning to change, and we hope that that will evolve little by little. And also there are things like the Global Commission on Drugs that has eminent personalities from the world of politics. Unfortunately, that commission had made some clear statements, obvious statements about the harm of prohibition, but it only assembles former ministers and former leaders, but at least it is there. And Miguel will give the floor to the room from the floor. Any questions from the floor for the participants in the panel? My name is Dr. Mackay. I come from a rural area, and I'm faced to the increase of the suppression of licenses, not of qualitative dose, not quantitative dose of cannabis. I want to know the experience of countries that have legalized and your opinion also on this problem, because these are consumers of our age who have consumed for a long time, and I would like to know how Uruguay and Colorado, with regards to the legislation prevention, with the quality and the quantity of dose, how do you control that?
Driving license.
What happens with controls of cannabis, of THC, with people who drive, whether it's leisure cannabis or therapeutic cannabis?
Driving is very messy for a number of reasons. The best of the hardest thing is that we've used cannabis tax revenue to train officers to better spot people driving while high. So our arrest rates for driving while high have gone up, but that's mainly because we've just trained officers to be better at arresting people while driving while high. The better data comes out of what is called the fatal accident reporting system, just because there's no observation bias in it. That does show, again, people testing positive for cannabis more often involved. There's more often when people are in a fatal accident, they are testing positive for cannabis than before legalization. However, more broad studies about whether or not fatal accidents have gone up in Colorado post-legalization show very minor changes. Not really the safety of both Colorado and Washington, according to studies being done, either barely reach statistical significance or do not reach statistical significance in differences between before legalization and after legalization. For those that don't know, it's actually a very complicated science right now behind driving while high. There is no test for intoxication. There's test for presence of THC. And THC and intoxication are not necessarily the same thing. And so in Colorado, our system is that you have if you have 5 nanograms of THC in your blood and fail a sobriety test, then you can get a conviction. But unlike alcohol, where if you blow a certain number, you have a conviction, we don't treat THC the same way, because you could have not used for a week and still have 5 nanograms of THC within your bloodstream. Technologies are advancing in this area, but right now there is no real way of testing for intoxication roadside.
Oui.
Juste un commentaire, c'est vrai que
Just a comment. Contrarily to alcohol, we only prosecute when the THC is found on the tests. So you may have not smoked for 3 to 4 days. You still have cannabis, but you do not have the effects. But this picks up to the same thing. It's because this is an illegal product. So if you have that product in the bloodstream, then you're going to be penalized, and this, of course, doesn't really make sense. What is the situation in Uruguay? Yeah. On cannabis while driving, 2 things. When you drive, what is prosecuted? What is prosecuted is the fact that you drive under the influence of cannabis. And when we say under the influence of cannabis, it means that you must have a plasma level of cannabis, which I can't remember right now, but it is pretty much defined. Now, in France again, in France, this is a French situation. So in France, this is what is sufficient to have you prosecuted. So the police officers are entitled to have a test, a rapid test, on site, but it must be followed by a blood test as well, so as to have a plasma quantification as well, because then, but it has changed, Jean-Pierre. Now, the saliva tests are sufficient for you to be prosecuted, and you do not need to have a blood sample, except if a person asks for it, and they will have to pay for the test. And most of the time, you know, they're under the influence and they don't want to ask for it anyway. So this change it changed less than 12 months ago. So this is why we recommend to all users to always ask for a blood test, because time for you to go to the hospital then is going to decrease. You're going to save time, and also when you have a blood test, then you have really accurate results. However, I would like to underline that contrarily to alcohol, you have some tolerance for drinking while driving, while for THC, there's 0 tolerance from the police. Well, I think the difference between the United States and France, there are no systematic controls. In the United States, as Andrew said, you don't necessarily have to have an accident. But if people are funny while driving, they're going to be tested and they're going to be controlled either for alcohol or for cannabis. In France, it's a lot more complicated. You know that you have random controls, and you also have systematic controls, even if they have no suspicious behaviors. I met a medical doctor in Seattle the other day, and he was using cannabis for a therapeutic use. And he was completely flabbergasted by the question. He said, well, I do take cannabis for medical reasons, and I drive. And, well, you know, I'm a dermatologist myself by trade. I'm not a specialist in addictions. But I think that if you have a fixed concentration of cannabis in the blood, maybe you do not have that high effect. Maybe Bernard Rock could shed some light on that. But therefore, the medical doctor in Seattle told me, well, you know, I'm not at risk. I will be at risk only if I have a funny driving or because we do not have systematic screening there. So this is very practical, and we'll need to think about it in France. So at the time being, we haven't changed that model, and people are prosecuted. And it's almost a form of persecution as well. So we need to be more open, more pragmatic, and we need to try and change paradigm. Another question from the public. Actually, yeah, I see there, lady at the back. Yeah, lady. Hello. Can you please introduce yourself? I'm named Fiona. I come from around Paris. I'm a nurse, but also train healthcare professionals in prescribing cannabis. 2 questions. In Uruguay, the products that are sold in the pharmacy, are they considered as OTC, or do you need a prescription? And second question, the status of synthetic cannabis, so in Canada, in the United States, and in Uruguay. We know that they are dangerous, the synthetic cannabinoids. We know they are very dangerous, so what is the status in the legislation? Thank you.
No,
Well, first of all, I would like to answer to the previous question. In Uruguay, the driving controls for alcohol and cannabis are permanent and random, and the tolerance for alcohol is 0. And for cannabis, it's also 0 tolerance. But then when there is a doubt, at the request of the driver, he can have his license removed, and he can have a blood test to determine the plasma levels of cannabis. Also, there is a protocol, and you have to remember that, from the point of view of the work environment, because also there is a risk of working under the effects of alcohol and also under the effects of cannabis. There is a protocol that was made in agreement with the unions at work. It's long to explain, but there are controls upon request and with the acceptance of the trade union, and if there are serious problems that are detected, they can be referred to treatment. It is complicated, but there are the controls. The cannabis in the pharmacy is not taken out with a medical prescription. You just have to, the user of the cannabis just has to register in the post office, and then you join a list of people who have the right to withdraw 10 grams per week and 40 per month for leisure use. But currently, this is being debated, a national system for medicinal and therapeutic cannabis that has other works differently, but it's not exactly a medical prescription. There are other instruments that can allow users to have access to medical cannabis, but leisure cannabis does not require a prescription. You don't have to go to the doctor to have your right to have your personal dose of cannabis.
It's illegal throughout the United States, but the incidence of use of synthetic cannabis resulting in hospitalization or death has gone way, way, way down to almost 0 in any country, in any state with more liberalized cannabis laws. And so it is actually a positive that isn't touched upon very often, because some outbreaks have resulted in deaths due to synthetic cannabis. CBD right now, due to the hemp laws, there are a few incidents of people, of bad actors, mixing synthetic CBD with organic CBD, and it making people sick, which goes to a need for better quality control at the top level.
Thank you, Andrew. Une question.
One question right in the middle here, right before lunch.
I have a question for Romani. We all hope that with the new 5-year law, there would be a reduction in crime. But we haven't seen this yet. Is it because it's too early? Do you think there are other factors? Because in the northern provinces, there are other separate factors that may be having an influence in the fact that there's no reduction in crime yet. Well, I think that the increase in crime in Uruguay is not necessarily linked to the drugs trafficking of marijuana. It is possible to identify that, but it is true that with the sales we have affected the cannabis market, and we have affected the criminal organizations that work with that. But they have a great capacity of reconverting their business portfolio. They are never specialized in any one thing. And I think that crime in Uruguay and in other countries in Latin America, there's part which is involved with drugs. Others has its own logic, and that doesn't mean that progress with regulation will affect. Some people even say it can evenly negatively have a negative effect, but I think not. I think to take on the responsibility for that market, I think it's positive for the state and for public health. But the crime is not eradicated with the drug system, because there are other multiple factors that I think still we haven't unraveled all of this sufficiently anywhere, I think, yet.
Milton.
Thank you, Milton. Bernard Roch, would you like to say something about driving with cannabis? Yes. I think the first thing that you have to do is to ask the people who sell these medicaments to have on the boxes, on the packages, to have signs, symbols, recommendations that you mustn't drive if you take this kind of cannabis. It's like with any other medicine also. There's a little explanatory leaflet inside the box that tells you the advice to people who want to drive, so that we can ensure that they are not under the effect, which is often very bad for driving, but not only driving. So that is the first comment. And with regards your comment about the quantities of the dose with different methods, the saliva test, there's a gentleman I know who says his test is very reliable, but I doubt it. But I recommend that if ever you have that test, to have a blood test. I think that is important and essential, I think. I have a question for Mrs. Obradovic, and your presentation was really excellent, but you impressed me a lot because you said there could be a discrimination between young people who do not have access for financial reasons to the drugs that are being sold in the coffee shops, and those who could, and what they can get in the black market. And it seems to be a discrimination. You can see immediately that in the United States, the black population will be attracted by the perverse side of this. But this is a question of revenue. There's a financial, economic inequality in the access that people have to these molecules. Yes, these are counterproductive effects, which doesn't affect only the young, it affects all consumers as a whole. It was particularly true when the market was opened out with a lowering of price afterwards. that could change, and the other social and racial discrimination in the United States is access by operators to the market. And in California, there were programs to promote social fairness and to favor the access of certain communities to the market. So this is one of the latest trends in the states that have legalized to ensure that the market is accessible to all the different racial, ethnic and social groups. That's true because France wants to have equality between the rich and the poor, and that will be a source for debate. And that is why perhaps you need an American capitalist model. Would want a more community model like a cannabis social club. You've seen in Catalonia, there are more than 800. So these are things that can be done. But in any case, the French pro-cannabis associations are really working on a social club system rather than an American-type system where I wonder whether big companies, big enterprises, do these big companies, do they really do risk reduction with cannabis? Because there's risk reduction that has to be done, obviously. Whilst in the cannabis social clubs, there's a real risk reduction that occurs with cannabis. Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you all for participating in this lecture. In this panel, I'll just finish with a couple of words of conclusion to Bernard Kouchner, who's had a very important role, and I'm very pleased to have been able to participate in such a beautiful conference. I think you're a little bit optimistic compared to my practical experience, but I've learned a lot of things, and it's true that the role of the economy and the role of money, of plantations, can have a very perverse role. The fact that Americans get rich is that a lot of money goes into Canadian money. That's not going to be a very positive argument, if you agree. So there's two of us. But I think that I would like to thank, look, Jean-Pierre. I thought you'd left. I would like to convey this to you. I find that marvelous. It's open-mindedness and really sharp, scientifically speaking. Congratulations. Let's continue. It's not necessary to do it every 2 years. You can do it every year. Thank you. Thank you.